So Ukraine just offered Russia a path to end the war, saying effectively, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. Now, while I wouldn't expect Putin to agree to this, it does show something that's being picked up in Russian media. For the first time in the war, Ukraine would be entering negotiations from a position of strength and could demand more than ever before. Again, not my words, but Russia's. It's also great timing for the first Ukraine aid package to pass the U.S. House of Representatives in 2 years, and more on that at the end of today's video. Now, yesterday, Ukrainian President Zelensky sent an open letter to the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. The full text of that article or that statement will be in the description below. I'm going to pull out a couple of key segments to give you the overall gist of the message that was being relayed. He said, quote, "Whatever you may say about NATO, geopolitics, or the Russian language, this war is your personal choice. A war without a real cause. That is how history will remember it. We can all see that Russians are finally becoming less comfortable with this reality, with the fact that the war is bringing more and more negative consequences to Russia. They do not like our drones and missiles. They do not like gasoline shortages and constantly rising prices. They do not like the constant restrictions. They do not like your intention to launch a second wave of mobilization in order to expand the war into another direction in Ukraine or to use it against other countries neighboring Russia. They do not like the fact that there is no end in sight to your war." For what it's worth, we've been seeing more and more from the Ukrainian side talking about this second Russian mobilization that is kind of secretly in the works. We're hearing that a little bit from Russia as well, where more and more mill bloggers and war correspondents are saying that is probably being discussed, at least more in the conversation now than it has been in years. So interesting that Ukraine's kind of hammering on that as well. A big component of that is the idea that as soon as Putin has to mobilize more kind of average Russians, there's going to be more pushback across the country for this war and essentially more of a demand to bring it to a close. Zelensky says Ukraine has preserved its independence, and it will preserve it despite all predictions to the contrary. "We have united many around the world to stand with Ukraine and against you. We found the weapons and the financing we needed. We received support, you received sanctions, and this will continue until there is justice for Ukraine, the justice we seek, and the justice that can be achieved." And Zelensky did lay out kind of a big picture view of what this path to the end of the war could look like. He says, quote, "Ukraine proposes ending this war through direct negotiations between us and you. Direct talks between Putin and Zelensky." He says that he proposes a meeting in Switzerland, Turkey, or the countries of the Arab world, many that are able and willing to host such a meeting. And he said he suggests they set a clear date for that meeting between the two leaders of the nations. He said Ukraine is ready for a full ceasefire for the duration of the negotiations, as well as an all-for-all exchange of prisoners of war. He said this could become a good prologue to ending the war. So again, at a high level, what Zelensky has offered Putin here is meeting face-to-face. And he does, throughout the course of the letter, say, it doesn't make sense for me to go to Moscow, and it doesn't make sense for you to come to Kyiv. Let's just scrap that idea. Let's meet at a neutral party. That's where he throws out Switzerland, Turkey, and countries of the Arab world. But then notably saying, let's set a date for the meeting, and while those talks are going on, a full ceasefire. Now, this is a bit of a trap that's being set for Russia in a couple different ways, and it's a smart move from Zelensky. From the Russian side, I want to mention that we haven't heard anything officially yet. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, says that Putin so far has no response. Honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if Putin doesn't acknowledge this at all. There's been very, very little mention of this open letter at all in kind of traditional Russian media, but in the blogger space, we've got kind of a mix of opinions, and that's what we're going to jump into here. Maxim Klishnikov, a war correspondent in Russia, says, quote, "It is both an open challenge and an attempt to set up a political trap. If Zelensky's proposals are accepted, then Russia will not get the rest of the Donetsk region. This would mean a loss of face to our leadership. If we refuse, Zelensky will present himself as a peacemaker, shifting the blame to our leadership and intensifying the pressure of anti-Russian forces on Trump in the United States. As a conclusion, according to Klishnikov, Ukraine intends to pressure and take advantage of both the growing systemic crisis in our country and Trump's increasingly precarious position in the United States." So the way that Klishnikov is laying this out is it's kind of lose-lose for Putin at this point. And again, it shows, and we're going to hear this directly from some Russian sources in a moment, that Ukraine has the upper hand. It's just why they're proposing negotiations right now. Alexander Kotz, another Russian mill blogger, writing an article, and Kotz, for what it's worth, has become more and more just kind of like a mouthpiece for the Kremlin, which is not common across all mill bloggers, but Kotz is kind of taking the very, very hardline Russian stance and is kind of one of the last holdouts of everything is fine. Everything is on track. Ukraine is set to crumble any day now. So know that as a bit of background of Kotz. He says, quote, Moscow has repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to compromise, while Kyiv has demonstrated a stubborn unwillingness to negotiate. This, in fact, is precisely what the Ukrainian Führer demonstrated with his letter. It resembles less a peace initiative than his famous piano solo, just as stupid and tasteless. Now, this is one where in Western media, by and large, what we've seen is that Ukraine has proposed and offered up a number of different ceasefires especially since President Trump came into office, and Russia has always had a reason not to go along with it. And they say, well, we'll do that if, or maybe we'll consider it, all these other things. That's pretty accurate, though. I mean, you really have to stretch to say that Russia has been, as Kotz is saying here, that Moscow has demonstrated a willingness to compromise. For what it's worth, I can't think of a single instance that Moscow has willingly compromised. The closest we can come is when Steve Witkoff came back from like his first or second meeting in Moscow, and he suggested that Russia might be open to giving up territory in Zaporizhia and Kherson that they have occupied in exchange for all of Donetsk and Luhansk. But Moscow pretty quickly pushed back on that and said, no, you misunderstand. We are going to maintain the lines there. We're going to keep all of that territory. We're just going to focus first on Donetsk. So very hard to see at this point. And I'm open to pushback on this, but it's hard to see any area where the Kremlin at this point has really shown a willingness to compromise with Ukraine. Now, Igor Girkin came out with, again, we can kind of expect this from him, the most frustrating assessment from the Russian point of view. Girkin is a Russian nationalist, convicted war criminal for shooting down a civilian airliner. He's currently under house arrest in Russia for his criticism of the Russian military. This is a man that wants to win the war and doesn't think that Russia is going far enough. He says, quote, at present, any negotiations, Ukraine will conduct from a position of strength. Our brave reports that we capture a village in a few days do not fool anyone at all. The front is actually standing still. The enemy is sharply increasing his strategic capabilities for strikes deep into our territory, for inflicting critical damage on our communications, transport facilities, oil and gas complex facilities, and industrial and military production facilities. At present, the enemy is on the rise, and our air defense forces are not able to repel these attacks everywhere. We are seeing that. If you're paying attention to this war, and we've talked about it countless times in recent weeks, this middle strike campaign is inflicting significant damage on Russian logistics and their ability to conduct operations at the front. And every single day for I don't know how many months now, we are seeing deep strikes carried out inside of Russian territory against precisely what Girkin is talking about there. Transport facilities, communications, oil and gas complex, military production facilities. That is noticeable. And it's not just noticeable to us in the West that are watching this play out on the news. It is arguably, for the first time in the war, noticeable to the Russian people. All right, some of these oil refineries that go up in smoke, you can't brush that under the rug and say nothing happened or everything was intercepted, especially when a specific facility is hit day after day after day after day. The fires get put out. The next day, more Ukrainian drones arrive. The Russian people, again, this is spreading. They're starting to notice that the war is coming home to them. And maybe all of the rosy reports they're seeing on the TV and hearing from the Russian Ministry of Defense maybe don't line up with reality. Girkin says, quote, in this situation, Zelensky will be in an exceptionally advantageous position at the negotiations and will demand even more than he could have demanded a year ago when these negotiations did not take place. In order to talk directly with Zelensky, we first need to achieve victories. Then we will be able to talk to him, at least from a position of strength. Now, if you go back to when President Trump first entered office and we saw what I would argue was a push from the Russian side to try to find some sort of negotiated settlement. They were they were open to the talks is the best way to put it, but a lot of what they were asking for and looking at was essentially a Ukrainian surrender. They wanted to accomplish their military objectives at the negotiating table, which is a thing that happens throughout war, and it's probably how this war is going to end as well. But at that time, we saw the shutoff of U.S. aid to Ukraine. There's reports that the U.S. was shutting off intel sharing with Ukraine. So Ukraine is facing a shortage of ammunition, likely a shortage of support, especially from the United States. And Russia was on the move. They were on the verge of taking Pokrovsk. I mean, I know they've been on the verge of taking Pokrovsk for a long time, but at that point, it looked like the city was on the verge of falling. Russia felt as though, and I think it's safe to say, they had the upper hand. They were advancing on the battlefield. Ukraine was not. Ukraine was losing support in the United States, and Russia felt like they had clear skies ahead. That's changed. And now that it's changed, Ukraine is the one proposing negotiations. Now, the timing of this is interesting because just yesterday, a few hours after President Zelensky issued this open letter to Putin, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the first Ukraine aid bill in 2 years. It's pretty notable. And I can't help but think of the General George Patton quote when seeing this. Patton famously said, quote, "Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser." And what we have seen over the course of the last few months is a change of the initiative. Ukraine has regained the initiative on the battlefield, and it is now Russia responding to Ukraine, trying to figure out how to stop these middle-range strikes, trying to find new ways to advance on the front because they aren't, at least not at any respectable cost, how to stop Ukrainian deep strikes in places like like Moscow and St. Petersburg at the start of the economic forum. It is Russia on the back foot right now, and a part of me wonders if American politicians are seeing this and saying, the tide has turned. Let's make sure we get behind Ukraine while there's still time. The New York Times says, quote, "The House voted on Thursday to approve a new aid package for Ukraine and impose a fresh round of sanctions targeting the industries fueling Russia's war economy after 18 Republicans defied their leaders to join Democrats in support of a bill that runs counter to President Trump's agenda. They say the legislation, which passed 226 to 195, would provide $8 billion in loans to Ukraine and $1.8 billion in aid for military and security assistance. In addition to putting new sanctions on Russian-affiliated businesses and officials, it would also punish foreign companies, organizations, and individuals that attempt to evade sanctions in an effort to support Moscow. They say the vote was the first time the House has approved significant financial support for Ukraine in more than 2 years. Now, a quick note here, this is not done. Far from it. It's a notable shift, seeing Republicans move over and support an initiative that for a while now has only seen support from the Democratic side of the aisle. It's also a pushback against President Trump. It's a pushback against Republican leadership. That is notable. However, there are still a few steps here. This goes to the Senate now. That is likely going to be harder to pass. But expect a campaign there in the coming days. I don't know when the vote is set. If it were to pass the Senate, which is possible, not too far of a stretch, then it would need President Trump's signature. And right now, it looks like President Trump is likely to veto this legislation. The stance that President Trump has taken and the detractors in the Senate and the House have stated in recent days is that adding arms to Ukraine, providing additional assistance to Ukraine, and adding sanctions to Russia impedes President Trump's ability to negotiate a settlement to end the war. And I can understand that angle, but at this point, it doesn't have any teeth, personally. Look, if the negotiations were active and ongoing and we felt like a peace deal was close, sure, I can see wanting to step back and say, let's not muddy the waters any more than we are. That's not the case. Russia is not negotiating, has not negotiated in good faith. The way to get Russia to come around and actually negotiate is, as we've argued for a long time on this channel, pressure. And the way the United States can inflict pressure on Russia is through sanctions and through providing intelligence, military support to Ukraine. And that's what we're seeing the House of Representatives pass just yesterday. So we'll keep an eye on that. Again, big move, arguably the biggest change in U.S. politics in regards to Ukraine in the last 2 years, but there is still a ways to go. But pretty notable that does come right on the heels of Zelensky offering Putin an easy way out of the war, as he put it. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.